What happens when a corrupt cop tries to intimidate a frail old woman only to find out she's an undercover FBI agent? Buckle up, because this is a story of power, betrayal, and justice that will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, if you love stories that expose corruption, fight for justice, and keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. Trust me, you don't want to miss stories like this. The low rumble of the patrol car's engine vibrated through Mark Evans' seat as he leaned back, fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. Another dull night, another stretch of lifeless hours patrolling a part of the city he hated. The streets, dimly lit and lined with crumbling buildings, felt like they belonged in a time long forgotten. Boarded-up windows stared back at him. Graffiti scrawled across surfaces like the signatures of a hopeless generation. Mark sighed, his breath heavy with frustration, and cast a glance down the empty road ahead. This neighborhood was, in his mind, a lost cause, a breeding ground for trouble and laziness, filled with people who, as he often thought, chose to blame the world for their problems instead of fixing their lives. He'd stopped seeing these streets as worth saving years ago, a conclusion reinforced by the steady cycle of arrests, complaints, and repeat offenses. Tonight was no different. No calls, no excitement, just the suffocating monotony of his shift. His eyes wandered lazily until something caught his attention. A figure, faint in the distance, standing outside a closed corner store. He squinted, leaning forward slightly, curiosity replacing the boredom in his expression. It was a woman, hunched over slightly, holding a plastic bag in one hand and a cane in the other. He looked small, her frame swallowed by a bulky coat in the brim of her wide hat, cast a shadow over her face. Mark frowned. She didn't belong here, not at this hour. The streets were deserted except for her, and she wasn't moving, just standing there. Suspicious, he thought. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, and a flicker of adrenaline rippled through him. "What's she doing here?" he muttered under his breath. Years of experience had sharpened his instincts, or what he'd like to call instincts. In truth, they were patterns he'd learned to recognize, though many might say they were assumptions cloaked in authority. This woman, with her frail appearance and deliberate stillness, set off an alarm in his head. Too old to be out this late, too calm for these streets, too suspicious just to be loitering. Mark pulled a squad car to the curb, keeping his gaze fixed on her. His pulse quickened, not with fear but anticipation. This was what he craved. The moments where he could reassert control, remind people of his authority, prove that he still had power in this corner of a crumbling city. He liked the rush that came with it, the sense of being in charge, even if just for a fleeting moment. The woman shifted slightly, leaning on her cane, her bag rustling softly in the quiet night air. Mark watched her like a predator sizing up prey. She wasn't doing anything, technically, but that was enough for him. Out here, her presence alone was justification enough. Trouble didn't always come in obvious forms, and Mark had long since decided that appearances could be deceiving. He put the car in park and turned off the engine. the stillness of the night settling over him as he stepped out. The sound of his boots hitting the pavement was sharp, punctuating the silence like a warning. As he crossed the street, his eyes never left her. He noticed how she didn't flinch or scurry away, as most people did when they saw a cop walking toward them. She didn't appear nervous, didn't fidget. That lack of reaction set his teeth on edge. People were supposed to react to authority. They were supposed to be intimidated. This woman's calmness felt like a challenge, and Mark didn't like challenges. With each step closer, his resolve hardened. This woman was about to learn what it meant to stand out in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mark came to a stop a few feet in front of the woman. She stood motionless, her cane planted firmly on the ground, the grocery bag hanging loosely from her hand. Up close, she looked even older than he had thought, her skin wrinkled and weathered, her thin frame swaying slightly in the chilly night air. Her wide-brimmed hat shielded her face, but Mark could see her eyes. Calm, steady, and utterly uninterested in him. That alone made his irritation spike. "Hey!" Mark barked, his voice sharp, breaking the quiet. The woman turned her head slowly, lifting her gaze to meet his. She didn't flinch, didn't react with the fear or nervousness he expected. Instead, she looked at him like he was just another passerby, someone of no consequence. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, stepping closer. His tone was curt, authoritative, and designed to elicit obedience. "It's after midnight. You shouldn't be loitering around a closed store." The woman didn't answer right away. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression that was neither defiant nor submissive. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I'm just on my way home, officer." Mark scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Home? At this hour? You expect me to believe that?" His eyes flicked to the bag in her hand. "What's in the bag?" The woman shifted her weight, her grip on the cane tightening slightly. "Groceries," she replied simply. She lifted the bag slightly, as if to show him. Mar didn't care what she said. Something about her calm demeanor, her refusal to appear rattled, was getting under his skin. He had dealt with countless people in his career, and most of them knew better than to push back against a cop. This woman, though, she wasn't playing by the unspoken rules. She wasn't scared, and that infuriated him. "Show me," he demanded, his voice dropping lower, more menacing now. The woman sighed, her shoulders rising and falling as if she were indulging a child's tantrum. She lifted the bag higher, opening it slowly. Inside, Mark saw a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few canned goods. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing suspicious. "That's all?" he asked, his disbelief dripping from every word. He glanced around the empty street, searching for something, anything, that could justify the suspicion bubbling in his chest. "Yes," the woman replied, her tone even. "That's all." Her calmness was unbearable, a quiet challenge to his authority. He tightened his grip on his belt, the leather creaking under his fingers as he took another step forward. "ID," he snapped, Let's see your ID." The woman's gaze didn't falter. She reached into her oversized coat slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a worn wallet. She handed him her identification without a word. Mark snatched it from her hand, his eyes scanning the name and address. Evelyn Carter, local resident. The frustration gnawed at him. Nothing about her screamed trouble, and yet her presence, her unshakable calm, felt like a personal affront. He handed the ID back with a flick of his wrist. His teeth clenched as he leaned closer, his voice dropping into a growl. "Why are you really out here? I don't buy your story." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "I told you the truth, officer. I'm just trying to get home." Her composure was like a mirror reflecting his anger back at him. Mark's face flushed with heat. He straightened, his posture stiffening as he tried to reassert control. "Lady, you don't get to stand here and lie to me," he hissed. "You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I'm going to make sure you understand that." Evelyn sighed again, her gaze steady, unyielding. "I haven't done anything wrong." Mark's pulse quickened, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He felt his control slipping, his authority being chipped away by this woman's calm defiance. He had to do something to regain the upper hand. His hand shot out, grabbing her thin arm. Evelyn's body jerked slightly, her cane wobbling as she shifted to maintain her balance. Her eyes widened for a moment, more out of surprise than fear, and she looked down at his grip before meeting his gaze again. "Let go of me," she said softly, her voice firm. Mark's grip tightened. "You don't tell me what to do," he snapped, pulling her closer. His face was inches from hers now, his voice low and venomous. "You think you can just stand here and act like you're above the rules? Like you don't have to respect me?" Evelyn didn't pull away. She didn't cry out or plead. Instead, she met his fury with a steady gaze. "Respect is earned, officer," she said quietly. The words hit him like a slap. His vision blurred with rage, his jaw tightening until it ached. How dare she? How dare this woman, this frail, insignificant woman, speak to him like that, challenge him? "You should be scared," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know who you're messing with." Evelyn's eyes flicked down to his hand, still gripping her arm, then back up to his face. "And you don't know who you're talking to," she replied. For a moment, Mark froze. The way she said it, the quiet certainty in her voice, sent a jolt of unease through him, but the flicker of doubt was quickly swallowed by his anger. He had to shut her up, had to remind her who was in charge. Without thinking, his free hand came up, his fist connecting with the side of her face in a quick, sharp motion. The impact sent Evelyn stumbling backward, her grocery bag spilling onto the pavement, cans rolled across the ground, a loaf of bread landing in the gutter. Mark stood there, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched. The sound of the punch seemed to echo in the stillness of the night, louder than anything else. His heart pounded, his mind racing as he realized what he had just done. Evelyn staggered but didn't fall. She straightened slowly, one hand bracing against the cane, the other wiping a small trickle of blood from the corner of her mouth. Her expression remained calm, though her eyes now held a glint of something new, something that made Mark's stomach twist. "You're going to regret that," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that sent a chill down his spine. Mark's breath caught as she reached into her coat once more, this time pulling out something that gleamed in the dim light, a small black wallet. She flipped it open, revealing a gold and silver badge. "I'm Special Agent Evelyn Carter," she said softly, her tone steady and unyielding. "FBI." Mark's world tilted, the ground seeming to fall away beneath him. His pulse roared in his ears, his hand trembling as he stared at the badge. He tried to form words, to explain, to justify, but nothing came out. He was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of what he had just done. Evelyn straightened fully, her gaze locking onto his. "Backup is on the way," she said, her voice calm, almost sympathetic. "And you, Officer Evans, have just made a very, very big mistake." In the distance, the faint wail of sirens began to grow louder, signaling the end of Mark's illusion of control. Mark stood frozen, the weight of his own actions crashing over him like a tidal wave. He stared at the FBI badge in Evelyn Carter's hand, its gold and silver gleaming under the dim streetlight. His breath hitched, and his pulse pounded in his ears. It felt as though time itself had stopped, trapping him in the moment where everything he thought he controlled slipped irreparably through his fingers. Evelyn's calm demeanor was like a dagger to his pride. She didn't flinch, didn't cower, and didn't lash out. Instead, she looked at him with the steady gaze of someone who knew she had already won. "I gave you every chance to walk away," Evelyn said, her voice soft but firm, each word cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "But you just couldn't help yourself, could you?" Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, his tongue heavy. He wanted to argue, to deny, but what could he say? The evidence was right in front of him, his own actions laid bare for judgment. His eyes darted around the empty street as if searching for some way out, but there was none. The sound of distant sirens was growing louder now, a chilling reminder that backup was on its way. "Wait," Mark finally managed to croak, his voice shaky and uneven. This isn't what it looks like." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, raising an eyebrow. "Isn't it?" she replied, her tone laced with quiet incredulity. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I expected." Mark's heart sank. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She had set him up. Not directly, but she had known. She had seen the cracks in his facade, the patterns of his behavior, and she had been waiting for him to slip, and he had, spectacularly. "I didn't know who you were," Mark stammered, desperation creeping into his voice. "If I had, I wouldn't have—" "Wouldn't have what?" Evelyn interrupted, her gaze sharpening. "Used excessive force? Threatened someone who posed no threat to you? Abused your authority?" Her questions hit their mark, each one landing with precision. Mark's face flushed with heat, and he looked away, unable to meet her eyes. He felt small, exposed, and utterly powerless. The badge in her hand felt like a weapon, its very presence a symbol of how completely outmatched he was. Evelyn took a step closer, her cane tapping lightly against the pavement. "You've been doing this for a long time, haven't you?" she asked, her voice steady but unrelenting. "Using your badge as a shield, your authority as a weapon. How many complaints have you brushed off? How many people have you bullied into silence because you thought no one would hold you accountable?" Mark shook his head, his chest tightening. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. I didn't mean for this to happen." "But it did," Evelina said, cutting him off. "And now you're going to face the consequences." The sirens grew louder, their wails piercing the stillness of the night. Mark's stomach churned as the reality of his situation sank in. This wasn't just a reprimand or an internal review. This was something much worse. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Evelyn lifted her radio, her movements deliberate and measured. "This is Special Agent Carter," she said, her tone professional and calm. "I need immediate units at my location. Officer Evans is in custody for assault on a federal agent. Proceed with caution." The words hit Mark like a sledgehammer. Custody. Assault. Federal agent. Each word carried a finality that made his knees feel weak. He had been on the other side of these situations countless times, watching suspects break under the weight of their own actions. He'd never imagined he would be the one on the receiving end. As Evelyn lowered her radio, her gaze returned to Mark. "You know," she said, her voice quieter now, almost reflective, "I've dealt with men like you before. You think you're untouchable. You think your badge gives you the right to do whatever you want without consequences. But the truth is, you're just another bully hiding behind a uniform." Mark's jaw clenched, his hands twitching at his sides. He wanted to push back, to defend himself, but he couldn't. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had let his badge become a weapon, a tool to assert power rather than protect the people he had sworn to serve. The flashing lights of patrol cars appeared at the end of the street, their red and blue beams reflecting off the nearby buildings. The sound of tires screeching against the pavement filled the air as the vehicles came to a halt. Officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief as they took in the scene. Evelyn raised a hand, signaling them to stay back. She turned to Mark, her gaze unrelenting. "This is the part where your power ends," she said simply. "From here on out, you answer to us." Mark felt his chest tighten, his breathing shallow and uneven. The gravity of his actions was inescapable now, the weight of accountability pressing down on him like a heavy stone. As the officers approached, he didn't resist when they reached for his wrists, snapping cold handcuffs into place. The metallic click echoed in his ears, final and unforgiving. Evelyn stepped back, watching as they led Mark toward the waiting patrol car. Her face remained composed, but there was a glint of something in her eyes. Resolve, maybe, or a quiet sense of justice. Mark glanced back at her, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. Tangika Mayonnaise Carter, one of the officers said, addressing her. Anything else you need from us? Evelyn shook her head. Not for now, she replied, her tone steady. Take him to the precinct. I'll follow shortly. As Mark was placed into the back seat of the patrol car, the doors slamming shut behind him, the world outside blurred. His thoughts spiraled, bouncing between anger, regret, and disbelief. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his authority would shield him from consequences. But now, sitting in the back of a squad car, he realized how wrong he had been. Evelyn watched the patrol car pull away, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had done her job, but the night wasn't over. Mark Evans was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and she wasn't going to stop until the entire picture was clear. Mark sat in the back of the squad car, his wrists bound tightly by the cold steel of the handcuffs. The world outside the car's window blurred into a mess of flickering streetlights and distant shadows, but he couldn't focus on any of it. His mind was racing, a relentless storm of fear, anger, and disbelief. How had it come to this? He replayed the last hour in his head, the confrontation, the punch, and then the revelation that had turned his world upside down. Special Agent Evelyn Carter, FBI. The words echoed in his mind, a grim reminder of his monumental mistake. Oh, this couldn't be real. This couldn't be real. He was the officer, the authority figure, the one who made the arrests. Now he was the one in cuffs, being driven to the precinct where he'd worked for years. The humiliation of it stung almost as much as the fear of what would come next. His colleagues would see him like this, stripped of his power, dragged into the same system he'd once controlled. The car pulled into the precinct parking lot, the red and blue lights reflecting off the brick walls of the building. Mark swallowed hard, his stomach churning as the officer stepped out and opened the door. One of them motioned for him to step out, and he did so reluctantly, his legs feeling like lead as he stumbled onto the pavement. The sharp click of the handcuffs behind his back echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. Inside, the precinct was buzzing with late-night activity. Officers moved through the halls, paperwork in hand, the hum of conversation filling the air. But as Mark was led in, the noise seemed to dull. Heads turned, conversations paused, and a palpable tension settled over the room. His colleagues stared, their faces a mix of confusion, shock, and judgment. Whispers spread like wildfire, low murmurs punctuated by the hiss and grunts of people completely unaware of what was going on. Is that Evans? What the hell happened? He's in cuffs? Mark kept his head down, his face burning with shame. He could feel their eyes on him, feel the weight of their curiosity and disbelief. He wanted to shout, to explain, to tell them this was all a mistake. But what could he say? He had hit an FBI agent. There was no talking his way out of that. The officer leading him stopped at the processing desk, where a sergeant on duty looked up from his clipboard. The sergeant's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained professional. Mark Evans, the officer said, his tone clipped. Assault on a federal agent. The sergeant raised an eyebrow, his pen pausing mid-air. A federal agent? He repeated, the disbelief evident in his voice. Well, that's a new one. Mark clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. He wanted to yell, to argue, to fight back against the judgment he saw in the sergeant's eyes. But he stayed silent, his shoulders slumping as the sergeant motioned for him to step forward. The processing was methodical, clinical, and utterly degrading. Fingerprints were taken, a mugshot snapped, and a file created. Every step of the process felt like another nail in the coffin of his career. Mark stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, refusing to meet the eyes of anyone in the room. As he was led away toward the holding cells, he caught sight of Captain Samuel Blake standing in the corner of the room, his arms crossed and his face a mask of calculated concern. Blake's sharp eyes tracked Mark's movements, taking in every detail. He didn't say anything, didn't make a move to intervene, but Mark could feel the weight of his gaze. Blake wasn't the kind of man who let emotions show easily, but Mark had worked with him long enough to recognize the signs and terrails. When Mark had worked with him long enough to recognize the signs and terrails and appropriate reactions. Kopkisaw noticed the sore stitch on the back of Mark's coat. Blake wasn't just watching, he was calculating. In the holding area, Mark was pushed into a small, cold cell, the heavy door clanging shut behind him. He sat down on the narrow cot, his head in his hands as the realization of his situation settled over him. He was in a jail cell. He had gone from patrolling these halls to being locked behind bars. The irony wasn't lost on him, but it didn't make the sting any less painful. Across town, Evelyn Carter walked into the temporary FBI office, the weight of the night's events pressing down on her shoulders. She was greeted by Agent Jonathan Reeves, who looked up from a stack of files as she entered. His expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "How did it go?" Reeves asked, his tone measured. Evelyn set her bag down on the table and sighed. "We've got him," she said. "Mark Evans is in custody. Assault on a federal agent. The evidence is solid, and he's going to have a lot to answer for." Reeves nodded, flipping through a file. "He's just the tip of the iceberg," he said. "If we can flip him, he might give us everything we need to bring down Blake and the rest of the corrupt officers." Evelyn hesitated, her brow furrowing. "I'm not so sure about Evans," she said. "He's loyal to Blake, and men like him don't turn easily. He's scared, yes, but fear can go both ways. Blake has a grip on him, and Evans knows that." Reeves leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table. "Then we need to make sure that grip doesn't hold. Blake will try to contain this, minimize the fallout. He'll probably send his usual enforcers to keep Evans in line." Evelyn nodded, her expression hardening. "We can't let that happen. Evans is vulnerable right now, but he's also our way in. If we lose him, we lose our shot at taking down Blake." The two agents reviewed the evidence they had gathered so far. A growing pile of complaints, reports of misconduct, and financial records that painted a picture of a deeply corrupt precinct. But Blake had been careful, keeping his hands clean while letting others do the dirty work. Mark Evans was the weak link, the one person who could connect all the dots. "We need to move quickly," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "Blake knows Evans is in custody, and he won't waste time. We need to make sure Evans stays alive long enough to talk." Reeves nodded in agreement. "I'll get the team on it," he said. "Blake is already on thin ice, and he knows it. The pressure might force him to slip." As Evelyn left the office, her mind was already racing with plans. She knew Blake's type, calculating, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to protect himself. Mark Evans was just a pawn in his game, disposable the moment he became a liability. And Evelyn wasn't about to let Blake win. Back at the precinct, Captain Samuel Blake stood in his office, staring out the window at the empty parking lot below. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. The news of Evans's arrest had reached him quickly, and he was already working through the implications. Evans had been reckless, losing his temper in the worst possible way. But Blake knew that one man's mistake couldn't be allowed to bring down everything he'd built. Damage control was his specialty, and he was already making calls, laying the groundwork to contain the fallout. Blake picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. The line clicked, and a gravelly voice answered on the other end. "It's me," Blake said, his voice low and steady. "We've got a problem. Evans is in custody, and the feds are watching. I need you to handle it." There was a pause, then the voice on the other end replied, "Consider it done." Blake hung up, his jaw tightening. He wasn't going down without a fight. And if Mark Evans became a liability, Blake would make sure he was dealt with quickly and permanently. The case against Captain Samuel Blake had been building for months, but Evelyn Carter's undercover operation had turned suspicions into hard evidence. Sitting in the FBI's temporary office, Evelyn spread a series of photographs, audio transcripts, and detailed reports across the table. Each piece was a puzzle fragment, and together they painted a damning picture of a precinct drowning in corruption. As she reviewed the materials, her thoughts drifted back to her time embedded in the precinct. Posing as a retired woman living in a disadvantaged neighborhood hadn't been easy, but it had given her an unfiltered view of the system's rot. She remembered how Officer Mark Evans, now sitting in a cell, would patrol her block with an air of entitlement. He treated the residents with disdain, issuing threats over minor infractions or stopping people simply because they looked out of place. Evelyn had witnessed him berate a teenager for sitting on a stoop, accusing him of loitering. When the boy's mother came out to defend her son, Evans responded with a veiled threat about noise complaints. Evelyn had witnessed him berate a teenager for sitting on a stoop, accusing him of loitering, and she realized that she was mad at Evans because she was angry and bitter. But Evans wasn't alone. The precinct operated like a machine, and corruption flowed through its gears. Complaints filed by residents rarely went anywhere. Reports of excessive force were ignored or buried. Even more troubling were the whispers of coordinated efforts to manipulate crime statistics, ensuring the precinct maintained an illusion of control while its officers ran unchecked. Evelyn's role had been to observe, to collect evidence without drawing attention. Every encounter, every interaction was documented, whether through discreetly recorded audio or detailed notes written late into the night. It had been exhausting work, but the patterns she uncovered were unmistakable. At the center of it all was Captain Samuel Blake. Blake wasn't the type to get his hands dirty directly, but his fingerprints were all over the systemic failures. He fostered an environment where officers like Evans thrived, turning a blind eye to their abuses while using them to enforce his own brand of power. Complaints against his favored officers were dismissed without investigation, and those who tried to push back often found themselves reassigned or ostracized. Evelyn's most damning discovery came during a precinct fundraiser, a thinly veiled networking event where Blake and his inner circle mingled with local business owners, politicians, and less savory figures. Blake had introduced Evelyn, still posing as a harmless retiree, to a local developer notorious for displacing low-income families under the guise of urban renewal. It became clear that Blake's precinct wasn't just complicit in these efforts, they were actively facilitating them. Evictions were expedited, protests suppressed, and problematic community leaders silenced. Back in the present, Evelyn's focus sharpened as Agent Jonathan Reeves entered the room, carrying another folder of evidence. He placed it on the table, his expression grim. "More records," Reeves said, tapping the folder. "Phone calls between Blake and his enforcer, Victor Cross. It's damning." Evelyn opened the folder, scanning the transcript. Blake's voice came through clearly in the recordings, discussing cleaning up loose ends and ensuring that certain people stayed quiet. It was the kind of language that left no room for ambiguity. "Victor Cross," Evelyn murmured. "Blake's fixer. He's been tied to intimidation cases, witness tampering, even a few suspicious disappearances." Reeve nodded. "And if we can link him directly to Mark Evans's arrest or his silence, we'll have enough to charge Blake as the orchestrator." The two agents worked through the evidence meticulously. Each phone call, bank transaction, and email painted a clearer picture of how Blake had operated with impunity for years. Officers like Evans were his soldiers, enforcing his will on the ground, while Cross handled anything that threatened to expose the operation. But Evelyn wasn't content with just Blake. The corruption was bigger than one man. Her team had already identified several other officers who had played key roles in enabling the abuse. Some were complicit out of loyalty, others out of fear, but all of them had contributed to the toxic culture that allowed Blake's empire to flourish. Reeves handed Evelyn another set of documents. Complaints that had been filed against Blake's officers over the past decade. The patterns were staggering: excessive force, racial profiling, falsified reports. It was all there, buried under bureaucratic red tape. "This isn't just about Blake," Evelyn said, her voice resolute. "It's about the entire system. Every officer who turned a blind eye, every complaint that was swept under the rug, they're all part of this." Reeves leaned back, his brow furrowed. "You're right, but we have to take it one step at a time. Blake is the linchpin. If we take him down, the rest will follow." Evelyn nodded, but her frustration was evident. The systemic nature of the corruption weighed heavily on her. It wasn't enough to dismantle Blake's operation. The entire precinct needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, and yet she knew that starting with Blake was the only way forward. As the team prepared for their next move, tension hung in the air. They had enough evidence to confront Blake, but they also knew the risks. Blake was a seasoned manipulator, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. He still had allies in the precinct, officers who would do whatever it took to protect their captain. Evelyn's phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the documents. It was a message from one of her informants inside the precinct. The message was brief but chilling. Blake knows. He's making moves. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Blake wasn't going to wait for the hammer to fall. He was already trying to cover his tracks, likely sending Victor Cross to deal with anyone he saw as a threat. That included Mark Evans, who was now sitting in a holding cell, vulnerable and isolated. "We need to act fast," Evelyn said. Blake's already in damage control mode. If we wait too long, he'll clean up his operation and we'll lose our chance." Reeves nodded. "Let's get the team ready. We go in tonight." The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparation. Warrants were secured, tactical plans finalized, and the team assembled. Evelyn worked tirelessly, coordinating every detail to ensure the operation went smoothly. There was no room for error. Blake's downfall had to be absolute. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Evelyn stood in front of the assembled agents, her expression resolute. "This isn't just about one man," she said, her voice steady. "It's about accountability. It's about justice for the people who've been hurt by this system. We're not just taking down a corrupt captain. We're sending a message." The agents nodded, their determination mirroring her own. They knew the stakes, and they were ready. Evelyn's thoughts lingered on the people she had met during her undercover work, the families displaced by greedy developers, the teenagers harassed by officers like Evans, the community leaders silenced by threats and intimidation. They were the reason she was here, the reason she had taken on this dangerous mission. And she wasn't going to let them down. As the team moved out, Evelyn felt a surge of adrenaline. The time for observation was over. Now it was time to act. Samuel Blake had ruled his precinct like a king for years, but his reign was about to end. Mark sat on the cold, narrow cot in his cell, his head buried in his hands. The quiet hum of the precinct's holding area did little to mask the storm raging in his mind. He felt trapped, not just by the steel bars surrounding him, but by the weight of everything he had done and the knowledge that there was no way out. For years, Mark had justified his actions, telling himself he was just doing what needed to be done. He had believed in the rules of the system as Blake had taught them. Control was paramount. Appearances were everything, and those who questioned authority were threats to be neutralized. But now, stripped of his badge and facing the harsh reality of his actions, the veneer of righteousness he'd clung to was crumbling. "Fie, Blake!" The name sent a chill through Mark's spine. The captain had always been a larger-than-life figure, a man who inspired both loyalty and fear in his officers. Blake had shaped the culture of the precinct, creating an environment where stepping out of line meant risking everything. It wasn't just about breaking the rules, it was about survival. Mark had seen what happened to those who crossed Blake or dared to question him. They disappeared, reassigned to dead-end posts, or buried under fabricated misconduct charges. Mark had done Blake's bidding because it was safer than defying him. And now, sitting in the suffocating silence of his cell, Mark realized he was expendable. He wasn't a partner or an ally to Blake. He was a tool, one that could be discarded the moment he became a liability. And after tonight, there was no doubt in Mark's mind that Blake saw him as exactly that. Mark's stomach churned as he thought about the FBI. They'd want him to talk, to give up Blake and the others. Evelyn Carter, with her calm composure and relentless determination, had made that clear. But Mark knew what would happen if he cooperated. Blake wouldn't let him walk away unscathed. The captain's reach extended far beyond the precinct, and Mark had seen firsthand what Blake's enforcer Victor Cross was capable of. Victor Cross. The name alone made Mark's throat tighten. Cross was a shadow, a fixer who operated outside the official chain of command, but was always one call away when Blake needed something handled. Intimidating witnesses, burying evidence, making problems disappear. Cross excelled at it all. And now, Mark was certain he was Blake's next problem to be solved. Across the city, Captain Samuel Blake sat in his dimly lit office, his fingers drumming against the edge of his desk. His jaw was tight, his mind racing as he stared at his phone. The news of Mark's arrest had come faster than he'd expected, and he knew the clock was ticking. The FBI wouldn't waste time. They'd press Mark, dangle deals in front of him, and try to turn him against the very system he'd been a part of. And Mark, weak and desperate, might just take the bait. Blake leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of cold calculation. He couldn't let that happen. Mark knew too much. Mark knew too much. Dates, the inner workings of the operation Blake had spent years perfecting. If the FBI got even a fraction of that information, it wouldn't just be Blake going down. The entire precinct would be dragged into the fire. His phone buzzed, breaking the tense silence. He picked it up, his voice low and measured. Cross. The voice on the other end was deep and gravelly. I heard about Evans, Victor Cross said. What do you want me to do? Blake's fingers tightened around the phone. Cross was a man of few words, but his efficiency was unmatched. He didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate. He simply got the job done. Mark's in custody, Blake said, his tone clipped. The feds will try to flip him. We can't let that happen. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that carried an unspoken understanding. You want me to shut him up, Cross said finally. Make it look clean, Blake replied. A suicide. Overwhelmed by guilt? Couldn't take the pressure? Something believable? Pry slung the elbow into his desk and looked behind him. Blake ended the call and set the phone down, his expression unreadable. He wasn't proud of what he'd just ordered, but pride had no place in survival. Mark Evans had made himself a threat, and threats had to be neutralized. Back in his cell, Mark's thoughts was spiraling. The walls felt closer with every passing moment, the air heavier. He had heard stories, rumors whispered among the officers, about what happened to those who became liabilities. Blake always denied involvement, but Mark knew better. Blake didn't need to get his hands dirty when he had someone like Cross on his payroll. Mark's heart pounded as footsteps echoed down the hall. He glanced toward the bars. half expecting to see Cross standing there, his shadowy figure ready to make good on Blake's threat. But it was just an officer, passing by without so much as a glance in Mark's direction. The brief reprieve did little to ease his growing paranoia. He thought about his options, weighing the risks. If he stayed silent, Blake might protect him. Might. But that protection would come with a price. A reminder that Mark's loyalty would forever bind him to Blake's world. On the other hand, if he talked, he'd be putting a target on his back. Blake's reach extended far beyond the precinct, and there were people who owed him favors in every corner of the city. Mark leaned forward, his head in his hands. He had always believed in the chain of command, in the unspoken code of loyalty that bound officers together. But now, sitting alone in his cell, he realized that code had only ever served one person, Samuel Blake. As the night wore on, Mark's fear deepened. He didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. He was running out of time, and the walls of Blake's empire were closing in on him. Evelyn Carter stood outside the holding cells, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she waited for the officer to unlock the gate. She had been here before, standing across from men who thought they were untouchable until the system turned on them. But something about Mark Evans was different. She had seen fear in his eyes, not just for himself, but for the weight of the secrets he carried. Secrets she needed if they were going to take down Captain Samuel Blake. The guard motioned her through, and she walked down the dimly lit corridor to Mark's cell. He was sitting on the cot, hunched over, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His head lifted as she approached, his expression a mix of exhaustion and wariness. She could tell he hadn't slept. "You've got a choice to make, Mark," Evelyn said, her voice calm but firm, "and you're running out of time." Mark let out a dry, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't know what happens to guys like me when they start talking?" Evelyn stepped closer to the bars, her gaze steady. "I know you're scared," she said, "but if you don't cooperate, you're going to go down for everything Blake's done. And he won't lose a second of sleep over it. You're a pawn to him, Mark. Expendable." Mark's hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. "You don't get it," he muttered, his voice shaking. "Blake's not just going to let me walk away. Even if I talk, even if I give you everything, he'll find me. He always finds a way." Evelyn crouched slightly, leveling her gaze with his. "You don't have to do this alone. We can protect you. Witness protection, relocation, whatever it takes to keep you safe. But you have to help me. I can't take him down without you." Mark's eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of resolve. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by the same fear that had been etched into his face since his arrest. "Look," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen what happens to people who cross Blake. You think you can stop him? You think a badge and a warrant will protect me? You're wrong. He's got guys everywhere, guys like Cross." Evelyn's jaw tightened at the mention of Victor Cross, Blake's shadowy enforcer. She had suspected his involvement, but hearing Mark confirm it added another layer of urgency. Cross doesn't scare me, she said. And he shouldn't scare you either. We have a team, Mark. We can take them all down. But we need you to do it. Mark leaned back against the wall, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I'm sorry, he murmured. I can't. I can't. Evelyn exhaled slowly, frustration bubbling beneath her composed exterior. She straightened and took a step back from the bars. If you change your mind, she said, her tone softer now, you know where to find me. But don't wait too long, Mark. Time's not on your side. As she turned to leave, she felt a pang of guilt. She had pushed him, but she couldn't afford not to. Mark was the key to unraveling Blake's operation, and without him, their case would be significantly harder to prove. Later that night, the precinct was eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by a heavy stillness. Mark sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the wall. His mind was a blur of conflicting thoughts, fear gnawing at him with every passing second. He replayed Evelyn's words in his head, her offer of protection, her promise to take down Blake. But every scenario ended the same way, with Blake finding him, or worse, Cross doing it for him. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled him from his thoughts. His heart raced as the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. He stood, his hands trembling at his sides, as the shadow of a figure appeared just beyond the bars. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, the door to the cell creaked open, and a man stepped inside. Mark recognized him immediately. Victor Cross. His breath hitched, and he took a step back, his body pressing against the cold wall. "Relax," Cross said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "I'm just here to make sure you don't do anything stupid." Mark's pulse thundered in his ears. "I'm not saying anything," he blurted out, his voice frantic. "I swear, I haven't said a word." Cross tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I believe you," he said. "But Blake? He's not so sure. Skip you for a second. I want to take a minute to tell you about another podcast I started called Label Behind the Label, since it really does help to show that we're talking about something other than philosophy courses." Mark barely had time to react before Cross moved. It was quick, efficient, and terrifyingly quiet. Within moments, Mark was on the ground, his vision blurring as his breath came in shallow gasps. Cross's hands were steady, his actions deliberate, and when it was over he stood, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves before slipping out of the cell as quietly as he had come. The next morning, Evelyn arrived at the precinct, her mind already racing with plans for the day. She had barely stepped inside when she saw the commotion near the holding cells. Officers were clustered together, their voices hushed, their faces grim. "What's going on?" she asked, approaching one of the guards. The guard hesitated, his expression somber. "It's Evans," he said quietly. He's dead. They found him in his cell this morning. Looks like a suicide." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "A suicide?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "How?" The guard shrugged helplessly, hung himself with his bedsheet. "That's all I know." "Oh, Evelyn pushed past the guard, her heart pounding as she made her way to the holding area. She didn't believe it. Mark had been terrified, yes, but he hadn't been suicidal. This wasn't a coincidence. As she approached the cell, her suspicions deepened. Mark's body had already been removed, but the scene felt off, too clean, too staged. She scanned the room, her trained eyes picking up on subtle details. The lack of signs of a struggle. Back at the FBI office, Evelyn relayed the news to her team. Jonathan Reeves looked up from his desk, his expression dark. "You don't believe it was a suicide," he said. It wasn't a question. "It wasn't," Evelyn said firmly. "Blake had him killed. Probably sent Cross to do it. Mark was a liability, and Blake doesn't let liabilities walk away." Reeves nodded grimly. "We'll pull the surveillance footage, check visitor logs. If Cross was there, we'll find him." Evelyn's jaw tightened. Mark's death was a blow, not just to their case, but to her personally. She had wanted to save him, to give him a way out, but Blake had gotten to him first, and now another life was lost to the captain's unchecked power. "We're not letting this slide," Evelyn said, her voice hard with resolve. "Blake thinks this ends with Mark, but he's wrong. This is just the beginning." Evelyn Carter stood outside the precinct, the early morning light casting long shadows across the parking lot. The FBI team was in position, each agent focused and ready. Today was the day they would bring down Captain Samuel Blake and dismantle the web of corruption he had built over the years. There was no room for error. She adjusted her earpiece, her voice steady as she addressed the team. "Everyone knows their assignments. We move quickly, secure the office, and seize all evidence. Blake won't go down without a fight, so be prepared." The agents nodded in unison, their faces resolute. Evelyn led the way as they entered the building, her badge held high. The officers at the front desk froze, their eyes widening as they took in the sight of the FBI swarming the precinct. Whispers spread like wildfire, but Evelyn didn't stop to acknowledge them. "Captain Blake!" Evelyn's voice echoed through the precinct. "This is the FBI. You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and facilitating corruption. Step out of your office with your hands up." The atmosphere grew tense. Officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. Blake had ruled the precinct with an iron fist, and now the cracks in his authority were showing. Evelyn's heart raced, but she kept her expression calm and unreadable. Blake's office door remained closed. Evelyn motioned for two agents to flank the entrance. She knocked sharply. "Captain Blake, this is your final warning. Open the door." The room was silent for a moment before the door creaked open. Blake stood there, his face a mask of feigned calm, but his clenched jaw and narrowed eyes betrayed his anger. "What is this circus?" he said, his tone sharp. "You're making a mistake, Agent Carter." Evelyn stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "The only mistake here was thinking you could get away with this. You're done, Blake." He smirked, a hollow attempt to assert control. "You have nothing on me. This is a witch hunt." "We'll see about that," Evelyn replied. She nodded to her team. and 2 agents stepped forward, grabbing Blake by the arms. He tensed but didn't resist as they turned him around and snapped handcuffs onto his wrists. "You're making a big mistake," Blake hissed, his voice low. "This won't stick." Evelyn didn't respond. She led the way into his office, her eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. The walls were lined with plaques and commendations, a facade of honor that contrasted sharply with the reality of Blake's actions. She motioned for the evidence team to begin their search. As agents combed through the drawers, file cabinets, and computer systems, Evelyn's attention was drawn to a locked safe in the corner of the room. "Get that open," she ordered. One of the agents quickly set to work, using specialized tools to bypass the lock. The safe clicked open and Evelyn leaned in to examine its contents. Inside was a black leather ledger, its edges worn from years of use. She carefully pulled it out and flipped through the pages. What she saw made her stomach churn. A ledger was a damning piece of evidence. It listed names, dates, and amounts, bribes, payouts, and favors exchanged over the years. Officers who had been part of Blake's network were named, alongside local criminals and influential figures. The ledger didn't just implicate Blake, it painted a picture of a precinct steeped in corruption from top to bottom. "Get this to evidence," Evelyn said, handing the ledger to an agent, "and make copies. This is our smoking gun." Blake, still in handcuffs, was being escorted through the precinct. Officers stopped what they were doing to watch, their faces a mix of shock, fear, and, in some cases, satisfaction. The man who had controlled their careers with an iron grip was now the one being led out in disgrace. As Blake passed Evelyn, he sneered. "You think this changes anything? The system's bigger than me, bigger than you. You can't fix it." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression hard. "Maybe not all at once, but we're starting with you." Outside, the media had gathered, their cameras flashing as Blake was loaded into the back of an unmarked FBI vehicle. Protesters who had been calling for accountability for weeks erupted into cheers. For them, this wasn't just about Blake. It was about hope, about the possibility of change in a system that had failed them for too long. Evelyn took a moment to breathe, her eyes scanning the scene. The job wasn't done. There were still officers to investigate, complaints to revisit, and victims to find justice for. But today was a victory. Samuel Blake's reign of corruption was over, and his arrest sent a clear message to those who had enabled him. As she walked back toward the precinct, Evelyn's mind raced with plans for what came next. She had uncovered the roots of a deeply broken system, and now it was her responsibility to ensure those roots were pulled up for good. The ledger proved to be the linchpin. As the FBI meticulously analyzed its contents, the breadth of Captain Samuel Blake's corrupt empire became clear. The names, dates, and transactions documented within its pages implicated dozens of officers, local politicians, and business owners in an intricate web of bribery, abuse, and exploitation. Over the following weeks, arrests were made in rapid succession, shaking the precinct and the community it served to its core. Evelyn Carter sat in the FBI's operations center, watching as updates from various teams poured in. Officers who had enabled Blake's schemes were being suspended, reassigned, or arrested outright. Witnesses were stepping forward, emboldened by Blake's fall, to share their stories of intimidation, violence, and coercion. For many in the community, this was the first glimpse of accountability they had ever seen. The public response was electric. News of the investigation dominated headlines, sparking a wave of protests across the city. Crowds gathered outside the precinct. Their voices demanded not only justice for Blake's victims, but broader reform in law enforcement. Signs bearing messages like "End corruption" and "Hopes of death," "Justice for all," filled the streets, a visual testament to the community's anger and hope. Inside the operations center, Evelyn reviewed the latest case files. The arrests weren't just confined to Blake's inner circle. The investigation had uncovered years of systemic failures, implicating officers who had turned a blind eye to misconduct and higher-ups who had protected them. This wasn't just about a single precinct. It was about a culture that had allowed corruption to thrive unchecked. "Blake's network is unraveling fast," said Agent Jonathan Reeves as he approached Evelyn's desk. "We've secured warrants for 3 more officers, and we've got enough to indict 2 city officials. It's bigger than we ever anticipated." Evelyn nodded, her expression serious. "It always is. The deeper you dig, the more you realize how interconnected it all is. This ledger isn't just evidence, it's a roadmap." Reeves hesitated, studying Evelyn for a moment. "You did good work here, Carter," he said. "Blake's done. The precinct's being cleaned out. You should be proud." Evelyn exhaled, her gaze dropping to the files in front of her. "It's not about pride," she said quietly. "It's about accountability. We've exposed the rot, but that doesn't mean it's gone. This is just one precinct, one city." Her thoughts turned to Mark Evans. Despite his flaws, he had been a product of the system, a man who had fallen in line with Blake's culture of control and abuse. His death weighed heavily on her, a reminder of the cost of their work. He could have been a key witness, a way to unravel Blake's operation from the inside. Instead, he had become another casualty of the captain's ruthless desire to protect himself. "We lost Evans," I believe Evelyn said after a moment. "I can't help but think about what might have been different if we'd gotten to him sooner, if he'd had the courage to talk." Reeves nodded solemnly. "Blake made sure that wouldn't happen. He kept his people in line through fear. But now, with him gone, maybe we can start rebuilding something better." Outside the precinct, the protests continued to grow. Community leaders, activists, and even some former victims of police misconduct took to the stage to speak. The message was clear. This was bigger than one corrupt captain. This was about reforming a system that had failed its people for far too long. Evelyn watched the news coverage from a television in the operations center. A young woman, daughter of a man wrongfully arrested by Blake's officers, spoke passionately about the need for systemic change. Her words resonated deeply with Evelyn, a reminder of why this fight mattered. The camera shifted to the precinct, where workers were removing Blake's nameplate from his office door. It was a symbolic moment, a small but significant step toward change. Yet Evelyn knew the work was far from over. Corruption didn't vanish overnight, and dismantling Blake's network was only the beginning. Later that evening, Evelyn sat in her apartment, the quiet a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few weeks. She sipped her coffee, her mind replaying the events of the investigation, the victories, the losses, the moments of doubt. It all felt surreal now. Her phone buzzed with a message from Reeves. The first wave of reforms is being proposed. They are starting to listen. Good work, Carter. Evelyn set the phone down, her gaze drifting to the city skyline outside her window. She thought about the families who had suffered under Blake's regime, the lives disrupted by his corruption. This investigation wouldn't erase their pain, but it was a step toward justice. She also thought about the officers who had remained silent, complicit in Blake's actions. Some had been motivated by fear, others by ambition. Rebuilding trust in the community would require more than arrests and resignations. It would require a fundamental shift in how the system operated. As Evelyn reflected, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The investigation had exposed the depths of corruption, but it had also shown her the strength of a community determined to fight for change. They had won a battle, but the war for justice was far from over. Tomorrow, the fight would continue. But tonight, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of quiet resolve. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey, and she was ready to keep walking.